Look, I really tried with this show, but my word, the Acolyte sucks donkey ball. So the Acolyte finished a couple weeks ago, and everyone hates it. I do as well, but when it announced its concept, I wasn't 100% opposed to it. True, I knew it was doomed from the start, considering who was in charge of this, but I felt the Acolyte is probably one of the few projects Disney has made that had great potential. A story of two sisters caught up in a conflict between two powerful factions that are doomed to tear them apart? Where have I heard that before? Now, obvious parallels aside, I think the initial idea Leslie Headland had on trying to add moral ambiguity between the Sith and the Jedi isn't inherently bad. Clone Wars shows a more militaristic side to the Jedi, and it's shown multiple times how their arrogance gets the better of them. In Andor, it shows how the underdog rebels from the original trilogy are much more complex, make great acts of sacrifice, and take dark measures in order to secure freedom to the galaxy. Moral ambiguity is no stranger to this franchise, but the reason people are up in arms about the Acolyte is because it doesn't understand how to approach these topics without insulting and degrading what came before. On top of that, it gives us a cool idea of siblings torn apart by conflicts out of their control, but this emotional core doesn't work because they're written so horribly. Meanwhile, a show that came out a couple years ago called Arcane strives to achieve basically the same thing. People, including myself, adore this show. So I want to compare and contrast these on different levels: the emotional core, character motives, and moral ambiguity. Now without further ado, let's begin.
Timmy, she's my sister!
So in Arcane, Powder and Vi are the emotional heart of the show, and they're why the story works so incredibly well. It takes place in the fictional city of Piltover, a thriving rich society built upon the poor and oppressed city of Zion. Vi and Powder are from the nation of Zion, and their parents are killed in a battle between the two cities at the beginning of the show. It leads to them being raised by their adoptive father, Vander, who was a leader in the rebellion against Piltover. When they're older, Vi has become a protector and somewhat of a parental figure for Powder. They carry out burglaries together along with other kids. Vi is very strong and isn't afraid to stand up for herself in a fight, but she's quick to anger and thinks with her fists most of the time. Meanwhile, Powder is small, timid, and not as experienced as Vi when it comes to street smarts and fighting. However, she desperately wants to live up to her sister's approval, and she uses her gifts in technology and inventions to help them out. And even though Powder screws up a job and Vi is angry about it, she always comes back around to remind her sister that she's special. We actually get to see their personalities, hobbies, and relationships unfold as the story progresses. There's a part in the story where their adoptive father, Vander, is kidnapped. Vi goes to rescue him but tells Powder to stay behind. She's not ready. Heartbroken, she can't help. Powder decides to use her new invention to help her family, and it works. Only it worked a little too well. Powder accidentally slaughters her entire surrogate family, causing Vi to lash out and leave her. Vi's taken to prison and Powder is taken in by the villain of the show. Years go by and it becomes a story of Vi trying to right the wrongs and coming to the conclusion that her sister has been forever changed by that eventful day. It's a dark and tragic story, but it works because not only is their relationship compelling, but it brings up many interesting questions on the nature of trauma, the dangers of miscommunication, how one action can have drastic consequences for the future, and it asks us the really tough question: who was in the wrong? So many interesting ideas. Unfortunately, the Acolyte does none of this. The relationship between May and Osha is supposed to be the emotional hook of the show, but both are so flat and uninteresting as characters, so when hits the fan, we feel nothing as an audience. So in the show, the two sisters are twins that were conceived using the Force by a bunch of space witches. May is super clingy to Osha, but Osha is indifferent towards the witch cult and her sister. She wants to grow up and be a Jedi, but May is infuriated with Osha's wishes. Through the flashbacks we have to them as children, they are constantly bickering and fighting. We get to see maybe one instance of them actually getting along. The Jedi eventually come to their planet and test them to see if they're capable of becoming Jedi. Osha decides to leave, but May is furious over her decision. So she locks Osha in her room and purposefully sets fire to her journal, which accidentally burns down the witch's base, presumably killing everyone there. Even though it was a mistake, Osha is furious with her sister. May ends up falling off a cliff and Osha is saved by the Jedi. Then fast forward years later and May is back seeking revenge against those who wronged her. This should be a form of tragic tension, but all I can say is who gives a A huge problem is that we only get one episode that shows them as children, which in theory could be fine, but you have to hook the audience with insanely good chemistry and writing for the characters. The reason as to why it fails is because their personalities and motivations are never explored past what's on the surface. Mei doesn't want Osha to leave, but we have no deeper reasoning other than it's her sister. Osha wants to become a Jedi, but there's no core reason as to why other than she wants to be a Jedi. Their personalities as well are so flat. There's no interesting or clear dynamic set up between them. Even the stuff they do show us is uninteresting or just annoying to watch. It doesn't help that their origin is told to us in flashbacks, so we couldn't get attached to not only their sibling relationship, but to anyone in the witch cult, because we knew they were all going to die. The biggest flaw for me personally, though, is when the tragedy happens. In Arcane, what happens between Powder and Vi is so effective because Powder was genuinely trying to help her family. She thought her invention would help in their most desperate hour, and when she realizes she's responsible for their deaths, it's heartbreaking. In the Acolyte, however, Mei's entire motivation that led up to the destruction of her home was done out of selfish pettiness. It could have been such an interesting arc where she struggles between wanting revenge and struggling with the realization she's the cause for all the bad things in her life, but Leslie was like, nah, this is good. So in both Arcane and the Acolyte, there is a surrogate father figure for both sisters. Vander is perfect in every way. We love him. So I instead want to focus on the morally gray dads of both shows, Sol and Silco. In Arcane, after Powder and Vi are separated, the main villain of the series, Silco, adopts Powder and through his influence evolves her into the evil persona named Jinx. We see how Silco has taught her to use her trauma, anger, and technical prowess as a weapon against their enemies in Piltover. However, we also see that Silco, who's been a ruthless, power-hungry drug lord up until now, actually has a deep emotional connection to his surrogate daughter. He sees so much of himself in her due to their similar circumstances of being abandoned by those closest to them. Even when he's finally reached an agreement with the officials of Piltover to have Zion be a separate nation, no longer under their oppressive rule, the one condition is he has to give Jinx over to them for her war crimes. Even though this is the revolution he's always wanted, he is completely devastated it's come at this cost. His partner Vander stopped fighting and became a pacifist because he saw what he was doing as damaging to those around him. That's why he became a father to Powder and Vi. Now Silco understands the struggles of fatherhood. Jinx confronts him and accidentally shoots him in the heat of the moment to save her sister. In his final moments, he tells her he was never going to give her up, and he leaves her with the message that there's no need to cry because she's perfect. Then he dies. Now, an analysis of the relationship between these two could be an entire video in and of itself, but here's the basic gist of it. Even though he's an emotionless evil drug lord, did he really care for Jinx? Yes, obviously. Does this make their relationship healthy?
Absolutely not.
However, with these conflicting traits, it makes him and subsequently their relationship so fascinating to analyze. As I said earlier, he was trying to bring out the best in her because he saw so much of himself in her. He wanted to create something great out of the devastation he found her in. The problem was he fed into her worst traits and flaws. It's an inherently toxic relationship, but you are still nonetheless emotionally wrapped up in every scene and scenario between them. In the Acolyte, the relationship between Sol and the sisters, specifically Osha, comes across as extremely weird and obsessive at times. In the beginning of the story, chronologically speaking, we learn that Sol is a Jedi who wants a Padawan because he wants one, I guess? Like seriously, we're never given a reason as to why he wants one so badly. And then when he sees the twins for the first time, he becomes infatuated with them. He finds out Osha wants to become a Jedi and he becomes connected to her. The home is burning down and he has to save either Mei or Osha from falling. Now, while logically he could have just force-pulled both of them over to him, he sacrifices Mei, lets her fall to her death, and takes Osha away. A time jump happens and we're told, rather than shown, he tried Osha for a while, but she left the order. Now, every day since, he looks at a picture of her to remind himself of her.
Stop it. Get some help.
It's eventually revealed that him and the Jedi were responsible for the death of all the witches, and so Osha, now corrupted by Jason Mendoza's character, chokes him to death, and I guess is training now to become a Sith. Now, before I get into why this is bad writing, I want to make it clear. I get the intention of the show was to show that the Jedi, and more specifically Sol, was lying to Osha about what happened to the colony of witches, but it doesn't work because of a lack of motivation and nuance. We're never given a reason as to why Sol is so desperate to have a Padawan, and subsequently why he is so creepily obsessed with these two girls. At least in Arcane, while Silco and Jinx's relationship is toxic, they have clear motives as to why they're bonded together. I guess it feels like he has responsibility and guilt after what he and the Jedi did, but when we flash forward to the present, Osha is gone doing a completely separate thing. If she was a Padawan or fellow Jedi at this point, we could fill in the gaps of their relationship and see how it blossoms from there, but they don't. So when Osha decides to kill him, there's no emotional crux for it to stand on. As far as we've seen and felt, she's basically killing a former acquaintance. They tell us their relationship rather than show it. Show, don't tell, Leslie. This is the basics of writing. For fuck.
Uncle Stan, is that legal?
When there's no cops around, anything's legal.
In the Acolyte, it's the conflict between the Jedi and the Sith. In Arcane, it's between the city of Piltover and the nation of Zion. Both shows have a perceived good side and bad side, but just because one is good doesn't make everything about them good, and just because one side is bad doesn't make everything about them bad. The conflict between Piltover and Zion from Arcane is so compelling because they add nuanced layers between the two factions. True, Zion is filled with violent drug lords and thieves, but Piltover at the same time cracks down on their illegal activities with militaristic police, rather than address the institutional and societal problems that are plagued upon them. It's a vicious cycle of violence. However, even though it's nuanced with layers of complexity, there's still objectively good people on the good side, and there's still objectively bad people on the bad side. Arcane has a moral framework for what is right and wrong. It's just a question of, will the characters be wise enough to solve a conflict? In the Acolyte, they try to give a morally gray aspect to the plot, showing how the Jedi can do sketchy things if it means keeping peace and order to the galaxy. The problem is, there isn't a single Jedi who is a good person. Every Jedi portrayed in the show is either corrupted, selfish, incompetent, or a liar. Meanwhile, the one Sith in the show makes vague comments about how the Jedi are the real bad ones, while at the same time violently murdering those in his way. He has no discernible good qualities other than him saying,
"From my point of view, the Jedi are evil."
We have objectively bad people on both sides, so there's no nuance or complexity to be explored. In Star Wars, you have a clear line of what is good and evil at the end of the day, because they literally have concepts of the dark side and the light side. Star Wars has a clear philosophical core to it, and the show either ignores it or just disrespects it. Also, the Sith, the ones that were supposed to be seen as like the cool underdogs in this show, are also the ones to eventually bring about the Third Reich in space. So I'll let Leslie and her progressive writing team explain why they want to be on the side of space Nazis.
If you were in Star Wars, would you be on the light or the dark side?
Dark side.
Yeah, 100% dark
100%.
side. So sorry, but the dark side is cooler.
It just is. It just is.
Master Skywalker, there are too many of them. What are we going to do?
It just is.
The Republic will be reorganized into the first Galactic Empire!
It just is.
Now, as I stated earlier, you can show moral grayness in Star Wars, as Andor and the Clone Wars have shown. Those work well because at the end of the day, there is a clear moral line of what is good and evil. The Jedi and Republic are shown to be incompetent and have their own internal struggles of corruption, and the Separatists and Sith have reasonable goals for why they want to separate. But still, even with those things in their way, the Separatists are still operating out of selfish interests and a lust for power, and the Republic and Jedi, even though they're flawed, are still fighting for democracy and resisting tyranny. In the Acolyte, the problem is that they don't have anything outside of the Jedi are actually bad and the Sith might not be so bad. That's it. They just have the Jedi being corrupted with no counterbalance with the Sith, other than some vague statements from characters. We see the long-term ramifications of the dark side and what it leads to, but this show is trying to tell us it's a good thing that Osha ended up on the dark side. It's manipulative, lazy, and toxic in its themes. Now, could this change with future seasons? Maybe, but as of right now, from what we've seen from the writers of this show, I doubt it. When I started the video, I said I wanted to give the show a chance. I honestly did. The concept could have been very intriguing, but truly analyzing this show from a philosophical standpoint opened my eyes to the truth about those in charge of making creative decisions at Lucasfilm. I see why the creators of this show love the idea of the Sith. They are like them in a lot of ways. In Andor, it exposes the Empire, and in extent the dark side, as a collection of incompetent, ego-driven, and morally bankrupt individuals who want to take over everything and twist it into their own distorted perceptions of the world they want to inhabit. Metaphors aside, Leslie Headland and people like her take over beloved franchise after beloved franchise and twist it into the world they want to inhabit. Hopefully, with the reception it's gotten, I think we're finally seeing a tide turn for the Star Wars franchise. Hopefully this nightmare will be over soon.